Fresh out of 5 years of Nazi occupation, the Netherlands was exhausted, damaged and rebuilding. Yet, soon after, it launched a war, not in Europe but in Indonesia, a colony fighting for independence. Why would a recently liberated country try to reimpose colonial rule by force? In this video we'll unpack the motives, myths and hard realities behind the Dutch decision to go to war against the Indonesian Republic. During the 1930s, the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, remained firmly under the authority of the Netherlands. The colony was enormously valuable, providing oil, rubber and tin that were essential to the Dutch economy. Yet, discontent was steadily increasing. A younger generation of nationalist leaders, including Sukarno and Hatta, openly demanded independence. Dutch authorities reacted harshly, political organizations were closely watched, and prominent activists were imprisoned or sent into exile. By the end of the decade, colonial rule appeared stable, but in reality it rested on censorship and repression. When Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940, the colonial government in the East became isolated from Europe. Dutch officials attempted to reinforce defenses and cooperate with the Allies, but their military strength was limited and outdated. At the same time, Japan, seeking natural resources for its expanding empire, targeted the oil-rich islands. In early 1942, Japanese forces advanced steadily across Southeast Asia, conquering the Dutch East Indies within months. For Indonesians, centuries of Dutch domination suddenly ended, only to be replaced by a far more severe occupation. The Japanese occupation of Indonesia 1942-1945 was one of the most brutal periods in the country's modern history. When Japan drove out the Dutch in early 1942, many Indonesians initially greeted them as liberators. After all, Japan claimed to be fighting for Asia for Asians, promising to end Western colonialism, but this promise soon faded. Japan's main goal was to exploit Indonesia's vast resources, especially oil, rice, and labor, for its war effort. Daily life quickly became harsh. Food and goods were heavily rationed, inflation soared, and millions were forced into hard labor as remusha, workers sent to build roads, railways, among other things. Many never returned home. Out of a population of 68 million, a United Nations study put the numbers of deaths in Indonesia at no less than 4 million, almost 6%. What's more, these innocent victims fell in a war that was never theirs, dying of starvation and deprivation in a military and economic clash between Japan and the Netherlands for the mineral wealth of their country. Indonesia is the world's 4th largest coffee producer, typically contributing about 6% of the total global coffee supply. Why am I telling you this? Well, in order to support this channel, you can buy a coffee so I can keep doing what I do, making history videos for you. See the link in the pinned comment or in the description. Also, if you haven't subscribed, now is the time to do it. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Indonesia was left in chaos and on the brink of revolution. The Japanese occupation had collapsed almost overnight. Their army still controlled the cities, but their empire was no more. Into this power vacuum stepped Indonesian nationalists, who had spent years preparing under Japanese supervision. On August 17, 1945, just 2 days after Japan's surrender, Sukarno and Hatta proclaimed Indonesia's independence in Jakarta. Across the islands, youth groups and militias took up arms, seizing weapons, police stations, and government offices. The situation quickly spiraled into violence, with the Dutch still imprisoned by Japan and the Allied forces slow to arrive. Radical youth groups saw an opportunity to wipe out any trace of colonial rule. This period from late 1945 into 1946 became known as the Bersiap, meaning get ready in Indonesian. It was a chaotic, violent phase marked by revenge attacks against Europeans, Indo-Europeans, and perceived collaborators. Thousands of men, women, and children were killed, and social order collapsed in many areas. When British and later Dutch troops eventually returned, they found the country transformed. The old colonial hierarchy was gone, replaced by armed Indonesians demanding independence. What followed was the Indonesian War of Independence, 1945-1949, a brutal 4-year conflict. Now, this Indonesian War of Independence cannot be simply reduced to Indonesian independence fighters versus Dutch colonialists. Within the Indonesian armed groups, there existed different factions that at times fought each other. For example, during the Madiun affair. But that is beyond the scope of this episode. Also, we must note that in 1945, the Dutch didn't have an army ready to retake the archipelago. Therefore, the British first embarked on strategic points on Java and soon clashed with armed Indonesian groups. Let's focus on the Netherlands. After the Dutch elections of May 1946, a coalition between the Catholic and Social Democratic parties emerged, with prominent Catholic politician Louis Beale serving as Prime Minister. Around that time, the British government, led by Clement Attlee, made clear the Dutch couldn't rely much longer on British military support in the East. The question now was whether the Dutch government, pretty much bankrupt at the moment, was able to finance an army that could bring the situation in their former colony under control. The Lieutenant Governor General of the Dutch East Indies, Hubertus van Mook, said he needed 75,000 men. That was in November 1945. 1 year later, he asked for 100,000 men to pacify Java and Sumatra. One Dutch military officer warned that a military solution would be very difficult, if not impossible. His name was Wybrandus Schilling. Now a general major, he had fought in Aceh decades ago. He warned that the troops of the Indonesian Republic, the TNI, were much stronger than anticipated. What they lacked in experience, they compensated with high morale. Schilling assessed that for Java alone, 200,000 men would be needed and the war could last up to 10 years. He asked the Dutch government to think about the following. Can the Dutch population of only 8 million, which suffered so much during the German invasion, endure the drain on human and material resources required to wage a war of reconquest of the scale and duration outlined in the previous analysis? A war of a scale never before seen in our colonial history. Eventually, Schilling was sidelined, but looking back, he was right. He knew his country was not able to solve the situation militarily. At the same time, the Netherlands, both the government and parliament in The Hague, and Hubertus van Mook and his staff in Batavia, Jakarta, choose the military solution to the Indonesian conflict that had been advocated by Konrad Helfrich, Simon Spoor, and virtually the entire senior command. Two large campaigns, euphemistically labeled police actions, were launched in mid-1947 and late 1948. The first action, codenamed Operation Product, had an economic goal: to recapture the lucrative plantations on Java and Sumatra. We clearly see how the Dutch waged a war in Indonesia for economic reasons, hence the credo, the Indies lost, disaster born, India verloren, rampspoed geboren. The Dutch East Indies had long been one of the most profitable parts of the Dutch Empire, supplying oil, rubber, and other raw materials. Many policymakers believed that restoring control over Indonesia was essential to rebuild the country. There was also a strong belief among Dutch politicians that Indonesian independence leaders had collaborated with the Japanese occupier, and that the August 1945 Declaration of Independence by Sukarno and Hatta lacked legal legitimacy. From The Hague's perspective, sovereignty had not been lawfully transferred, and order needed to be restored before any constitutional changes could occur. Dutch officials expected the negotiated transition to a reformed commonwealth structure, but under continued Dutch influence. Domestic politics and public opinion mattered too. Many in the Netherlands still supported empire. But Indonesian armed and political resistance did not collapse despite the Dutch military operations. Instead, Dutch forces were drawn into a brutal guerrilla war and a bloody pacification of territory that appeared conquered only on paper. Ironically, the deadliest periods came after the two major offensives. The turn toward war coincided with a reshuffling at the top of Dutch military in the Indies, partially intended to ease tensions with British forces still dominating Java and Sumatra in 1945-46. The government recalled Helfrich to the Netherlands and abolished his command position in early 1946, while other senior posts were reassigned. Looking back, historian Remy Limpach concludes in his book The Burning Kampongs of Generaal Spoor, one of the biggest mistakes made by those in charge was underestimating the enemy, even during the bloody conquest of the archipelago by the Colonial, which at first glance seemed to have been largely completed with the difficult and never definitive victory in the Aceh War, 1873-1914. The military leadership continued to assume that the enemy was an inferior native or indigenous opponent. The authorities displayed this contemptuous attitude again during the reconquest of Indonesia after the Japanese surrender in 1945. Already during their lengthy conquest campaign in Aceh, the Dutch had to learn a few hard lessons. For example, that European warfare had to be adapted to the guerrilla warfare of the enemy. This led to the development of the so-called contra-guerrilla tactics by the Corps Marechaussee de Voet. The story of the Aceh War is a fascinating one, not often featured on English-speaking channels. But History Hustle is the exception, because I have elaborated on this conflict with a 28-minute video. Click right here to check it out now. Buy me a coffee if you can, and thanks for watching.